Lieutenant Colonel Walter Vetelee pressed his palm against the cold steel hull of the lead Sherman tank. The metal trembled, a low mechanical purr that vibrated through his glove, up his arm, into his chest, where his heart hammered an entirely different rhythm. Behind him, stretched along the muddy German road, sat the full weight of Task Force Vesely, 37 tanks, 22 tank destroyers, and 900 men of the 2nd Battalion, 114th Infantry Regiment. The morning fog clung to the pine forest like cigarette smoke in a closed room. Vetelee had received the orders 3 days ago. Not suggestions, not recommendations. Orders. Break through the German front line, advance 37 miles behind enemy lines, liberate Stalag 9B before the Germans evacuate it. The intelligence officer who briefed him had used the word evacuate with particular emphasis, the way a doctor might say complications. Everyone in that room understood the translation. Death march, 6,000 Allied prisoners waited in that camp. The Red Cross reports called it a critical status situation. Vetelee had read those reports twice, then locked them in his desk drawer. Some images don't need repetition. Starvation rations, dysentery, typhus, hemorrhagic fever. The words on paper couldn't capture the smell, but Vetelee had been to Dachau 2 weeks earlier with a reconnaissance unit. He knew exactly what critical status smelled like. He pulled his hand away from the tank. His fingers left brief impressions in the morning condensation that faded as he watched. Temporary. Everything in war was temporary. Positions, plans, lives. Except the dead. The dead stayed permanent. Colonel? Captain James Morrison appeared at his elbow, clipboard in hand. Morrison was 23 years old and had been in combat for 6 months, which in the spring of 1945 made him a veteran. Tank commanders report ready. Artillery liaison confirms the barrage will commence at 0600. Vetelee checked his watch. 20 minutes. 20 minutes before they would punch a hole through the German line and race into enemy territory with the subtlety of a freight train. The plan was tactically insane. 37 miles was 3 times deeper than standard penetration doctrine recommended. They would be operating without secure supply lines, without reinforcements, without any realistic hope of rescue if things went wrong. The problem was simple. Things were already wrong at Stalag 9B. Every hour they delayed was another hour those 6,000 men spent dying. "What's the temperature?" Vetelee asked. Morrison blinked at the apparent non sequitur. "Sir? 42 degrees. Supposed to warm up to 55 by afternoon." "Good. The mud will firm up." Vetelee turned to face his captain. "You know why they picked us for this?" "Because the 44th Division is—" "Because we're expendable," Vetelee interrupted, not unkindly. "Task Force Vesely, you know what that name means? It's not English. It's Czech. Means cheerful or merry. Some staff officer's idea of irony." He smiled without humor. "We're the cheerful suicide mission." Morrison's face paled slightly, but he didn't look away. "Are we getting those men out, sir?" "Every single one." Vetelee said it with a certainty he absolutely did not feel. In war, confidence was a uniform you wore, not a truth you possessed. The first artillery shell screamed overhead at precisely 6 o'clock, a freight train flying backward through time, and Task Force Vesely lurched forward into history. Part 1. The Mathematics of Desperation. The numbers told a story that Washington didn't want to read. In the winter of 1945, the American military machine operated with a precision that would have impressed Henry Ford. Every division had its tables of organization and equipment. Every corps had its logistics pipeline. Every army had its replacement depot. The system worked because it was predictable. You could calculate consumption rates, fuel, ammunition, rations, men, with actuarial accuracy. Stalag 9B destroyed those calculations. The camp had been built to hold 1,500 prisoners. By April 1945, it contained 6,000. The mathematics of that overcrowding wasn't merely inconvenient, it was lethal. The Germans had stopped pretending the camp followed Geneva Convention guidelines sometime in February. The pretense had collapsed along with the Reich's transportation network, bombed into paralysis by Allied air superiority. No trains meant no food deliveries. No food deliveries meant no rations beyond what the local countryside could provide, and the local countryside, after 6 years of total war, could provide approximately nothing. The International Red Cross had sent 3 inspectors to Stalag 9B in March. Their report, stamped urgent and forwarded through Swiss diplomatic channels, reached the War Department on March 18th. The document was 17 pages long. The first paragraph contained the phrase, "conditions approaching those documented in Japanese prison camps in the Pacific Theater." In Washington, that phrase triggered a very specific reaction. Pacific Theater POW camps had death rates exceeding 30%. The Bataan Death March had killed 600 Americans in 6 days. If Stalag 9B was approaching those conditions, and if the Germans decided to evacuate the camp ahead of the Allied advance, the calculation was simple and horrifying. 6,000 prisoners, 30% mortality, 1,800 dead Americans. Unacceptable. The problem was equally simple. Stalag 9B sat 37 miles behind German lines, 37 miles past minefields, roadblocks, artillery positions, and Wehrmacht units that, despite Germany's collapsing position, still knew how to fight. The 44th Infantry Division held the nearest American position. Their front line traced along a ridgeline 3 miles west of the German defensive belt. On March 28th, Major General Dean McBride, commander of the 44th Division, received a classified order. The language was bureaucratic. Execute liberation operation of Stalag 9B POW facility. But the subtext was clear. Get those men out, fast. Use whatever force necessary. McBride assigned the mission to Task Force Vesely, named for the town of Vetelee in Czechoslovakia, where the 44th had fought in October. The task force would be built around Lieutenant Colonel Walter Vetelee's 2nd Battalion, reinforced with armor. Company C of the 749th Tank Battalion brought M4 Shermans. The 736th Tank Destroyer Battalion contributed its M36 Jackson tank destroyers, mounting 90mm guns that could punch through anything the Germans still fielded. The plan was straightforward in conception, suicidal in execution. Task Force Vesely would attack at dawn on April 1st. They would breach the German line with a concentrated artillery barrage, then race east toward Bad Orb. Speed was everything. The Germans wouldn't expect a penetration this deep. By the time they organized a response, the task force would already be at the camp. That was the theory. The reality was that April 1st wasn't chosen for tactical reasons. It was chosen because intelligence indicated the Germans planned to evacuate Stalag 9B on April 3rd. The math was brutal. April 1st was the last possible day to reach the camp before the evacuation began. April the 2nd would be too late. On March 30th, Vetelee assembled his company commanders in a farmhouse 3 miles from the front. He spread a map across a rough wooden table. The map showed terrain he'd never seen. Forests, roads, villages, elevation contours, all rendered in the precise symbolism of military cartography. Somewhere in those lines and symbols were 6,000 men dying slowly. "Gentlemen," Vetelee began, tapping the map with his index finger, "we're going to do something either very brave or very stupid, possibly both." He traced the route with his finger. Reach point, advance axis, intermediate objectives, Stalag 9B. The line his finger drew was 37 miles long and cut through German-held territory like a knife through paper. On paper. Reality would be different. Questions? Captain Robert Hayes, commanding Company E, raised his hand. "Colonel, what's our extraction plan after we secure the camp?" Vetelee looked at him. Hayes was a good officer, methodical, thought 3 moves ahead. The question was intelligent. The answer was unpleasant. "We hold until higher headquarters establishes a corridor. Division is planning a general advance to link up with us within 72 hours. And if they can't establish the corridor? Then we hold longer." The room was silent. Everyone understood the implication. If the German army recovered from its surprise and organized a coordinated response, Task Force Vesely could be cut off deep behind enemy lines, surrounded, besieged. The very situation they were trying to prevent at Stalag 9B could become their own fate. "I won't lie to you," Vetelee continued. "This mission violates standard doctrine. We're penetrating too deep, too fast, without secure flanks or lines of communication. On paper, we shouldn't succeed." He paused. "But those 6,000 men don't care about what's on paper. They care about whether we show up, so we're going to show up." Captain Morrison spoke up. "Sir, do we know the condition of the prisoners?" Vetelee pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. The Red Cross report. He'd read it so many times he'd memorized entire passages. 3,364 Americans, 2,600 from other Allied nations, British, French, Soviet. Most of our boys were captured during the Ardennes offensive. They've been in German hands since December. 4 months. 4 months of captivity in winter, with the German supply system collapsing. Vetelee didn't need to elaborate. The report says food rations have been reduced to 300 calories per day. For perspective, a soldier in combat requires 3,000. Disease is endemic. Dysentery, pneumonia, typhus. The camp has a makeshift hospital, but no medicine, no bandages, no anesthesia. Men are dying at a rate of approximately 12 per day. 12 per day. Vetelee let that number hang in the air. 12 Americans dying every 24 hours while the military bureaucracy processed orders and shuffled papers and scheduled offensives. "We attack tomorrow at dawn," Vetelee concluded. "Get your men ready. And gentlemen," he looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer, "we're bringing all of them out, every single one." It was a promise he had no authority to make and no certainty he could keep. But leadership, he had learned, sometimes required saying things you believed should be true, even if reality disagreed. Part 2. The Hammer Falls. The artillery barrage began at 6 o'clock with the punctuality of German engineering, which was ironic given that it was American shells destroying German positions. Private First Class Thomas Riley, crouched in the back of an M3 half-track, counted the seconds between the shriek of outgoing rounds and the crump of impact. 6 seconds. The German line was approximately 3,000 yards away. Geometry and physics rendered an explosive force. Riley was 19 years old and had been in combat for 8 weeks. His high school physics teacher would have been proud of his ability to calculate artillery trajectories under stress. His mother, had she known where her son was at that moment, would have been horrified. The half-track lurched forward. Around Riley, 8 other infantrymen swayed with the motion, faces blank with the particular emptiness soldiers learned to wear before combat. No one spoke. The artillery barrage provided all the conversation necessary, a thunderous, repetitive argument that admitted no response. Sergeant Carl Dietrich, squad leader, checked his watch. 3 minutes. 3 minutes until the barrage lifted. 3 minutes until the tanks rolled forward. 3 minutes until they would find out whether the plan was brilliant or suicidal. Riley pulled his M1 Garand closer, checking the en-bloc clip by reflex. 8 rounds. The rifle felt solid in his hands, a piece of engineered certainty in a morning full of uncertainty. He'd fired it exactly 47 times in combat. He'd hit human targets 4 times that he was certain of, possibly 6. The numbers were important. If you reduced war to mathematics, it became manageable. Kill ratios, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure rates, the arithmetic of survival. The barrage stopped. The silence felt like physical pressure, like walking from a loud room into sudden darkness. Riley's ears rang with the absence of noise. "Go, go, go!" Dietrich was shouting, and the half-track was moving faster now, the engine grinding through gears, and ahead of them 3 Shermans were crashing through the tree line like iron dinosaurs, their 75mm guns swiveling toward German positions that Riley couldn't see but knew were there. A German machine gun opened fire. Tracers drew red lines through the morning air. Riley watched a tracer strike the lead Sherman and ricochet upward, a bright spark that seemed oddly beautiful until he remembered that each tracer represented 4 additional bullets he couldn't see. The Sherman's machine gun answered. Then its main gun fired, and the German position disappeared in a gout of smoke and splintered timber. This, Riley thought with perfect clarity, is completely insane. The half-track jolted over something, a log, a shell crater, possibly a body. Riley didn't look. And then they were through the German line, somehow, improbably, miraculously still alive. Behind them, the sound of combat faded with surprising speed. They were through. They were racing east. They were 37 miles from Stalag 9B with the entire German army, potentially between them and their objective. Sergeant Dietrich was grinning. "Easy day," he shouted over the engine noise. Riley didn't answer. In 8 weeks of combat, he'd learned that easy days were statistical anomalies, brief exceptions to the general rule that war was organized chaos punctuated by random violence. They'd penetrated the German line, yes. Now they had to survive the next 37 miles. The mathematics were not encouraging. Lieutenant Colonel Vetelee rode in the command half-track, monitoring 3 different radio frequencies while trying to maintain a mental map of his dispersed force. Command in mobile warfare was less about giving orders and more about managing chaos. "Lead elements report minimal resistance at breach point," the radio operator announced. 2 German strong points neutralized. Estimated enemy casualties 40+. Our casualties, 2 wounded, no killed. Vetelee felt a moment of relief so intense it was almost physical. The breach had worked. They were through. Now came the hard part. Staying alive for 37 miles. "Advance elements, maintain speed," he ordered into the radio. "Bypass resistance when possible. We're not here to fight Germany. We're here to reach Bad Orb." The radio crackled acknowledgement. Outside the half-track, the German countryside blurred past. Spring fields, scattered farmhouses, villages that looked postcard perfect until you noticed the shell damage and absent populations. This close to the front, the civilians had fled or been evacuated. The land looked strangely empty, as if war had erased not just armies, but entire communities. 3 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles. The task force rolled east like a steel snake, armor and infantry moving in practiced coordination. They passed German supply depots abandoned in such haste that supplies still sat stacked in neat piles. They passed Wehrmacht soldiers who stared in shock, then raised their hands in surrender, then stared in continued shock as Task Force Vesely simply drove past without stopping to process prisoners. "We're not here to accept surrenders," Vetelee had told his officers. "If Germans want to surrender, point them west and keep moving." 15 miles. 20 miles. The resistance intensified. German units, recovering from the initial shock, began to organize defensive positions. A roadblock at the town of Mernez, 2 anti-tank guns, a platoon of infantry, a determination to slow the American advance. The leading Shermans engaged from 800 yards, firing high-explosive rounds into German positions while infantry maneuvered through adjacent fields. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. The Americans lost 1 Sherman to a lucky German anti-tank round that penetrated the turret ring. 5 crew dead. The Germans lost everything, positions overrun, guns captured or destroyed, survivors melting into the forest. 22 miles. 25 miles. Vetelee consulted his map. They were approaching Bad Orb. Intelligence suggested the town itself might be defended. A German training depot was located nearby. Possibly 200 soldiers, possibly more, definitely equipped with more than rifles. The radio crackled. "Lead elements report visual contact with Bad Orb. Town appears occupied. Possible vehicle movement. Correction. Confirmed enemy armor. At least 2 assault guns. Maybe more." Vetelee swore quietly. Assault guns. Stugee 3s probably. Low-profile tank destroyers mounting 75mm guns. Deadly in defensive positions. This wouldn't be another quick firefight. This would be a battle. "All units converge on Bad Orb," Vetelee ordered. "Tank destroyers forward. We're going to knock on their door." The battle for Bad Orb began at 1400 hours on April 1, 1945, with an American artillery barrage that announced Task Force Vesely's arrival with emphatic authority. Captain William Hargrove, commanding the lead platoon of M-36 tank destroyers, watched the shells impact the town's eastern edge. Smoke rose in black columns. Buildings collapsed with the particular finality that high explosive rounds provided. Somewhere in that smoke and destruction, German soldiers were either dying or deciding whether dying was preferable to surrender. Target, building, 200 yards, 11 o'clock, Hargrove's gunner called out. Identified assault gun position. Fire! The M-36's 90mm gun thundered. The recoil rocked the entire vehicle. Hargrove watched through his periscope as the round struck the building's corner, demolishing the entire structure in a cascade of brick and timber. Whether they'd hit the assault gun or simply buried it was unclear. Either outcome was acceptable. German return fire was immediate and accurate. A 75mm round from somewhere in the town struck the ground 15 yards short of Hargrove's tank destroyer, showering the vehicle with dirt and rock fragments. The Germans might be losing the war, but they still knew how to fight. The battle evolved into a grinding, methodical destruction of German positions. American armor advanced behind artillery support, infantry clearing buildings room by room, tank destroyers engaging enemy vehicles from distances that negated the German armor's advantages. Modern combined arms warfare executed with industrial efficiency. By 1800 hours, Bad Orb's eastern sector was secure. The Germans had retreated to defensive positions on the town's western hills, the hills that overlooked Stalag 9B. Vetelee stood on the outskirts of the captured sector, binoculars raised, studying those hills. Somewhere up there, behind barbed wire and guard towers, 6,000 Allied prisoners waited. Did they know rescue was coming? Could they hear the battle? Did they dare hope? "Colonel, we have a German officer requesting parley," Captain Morrison reported. Vetelee lowered his binoculars. "Parley? We're in the middle of a battle." "He says he's from the prison camp, wants to discuss terms." Interesting. The Germans wanted to negotiate. That suggested they recognized their position was untenable, or it was a delaying tactic while they organized a stronger defense. "Bring him forward. Under white flag. Search him first." 10 minutes later, Vetelee met Major Wilhelm Schiller of the Wehrmacht. Schiller was 42 years old, rail-thin, and carried himself with the exhausted dignity of a man who'd stopped believing in victory but still remembered duty. "I am authorized by Commandant Ziba to discuss the transfer of prisoners," Schiller said in accented but clear English. "The camp contains 6,000 Allied prisoners of war. They are in poor health. A battle at the camp would result in casualties." Vetelee studied the German officer. "What are you proposing?" "Surrender of the camp without resistance. Safe passage for German guards to return to Wehrmacht lines." "And if I refuse?" Schiller's face tightened. "Then Commandant Ziba will execute his standing orders. The prisoners will be evacuated west, immediately." There it was, the threat that had driven this entire mission. Evacuation. Death march. 1,800 calculated deaths. "How long do I have?" Vetelee asked. "The evacuation order will be executed at dawn, April 2nd. 12 hours. They had 12 hours to secure the camp, or 6,000 men would be marched into the German interior under conditions that would kill a third of them. "Here are my terms," Vetelee said. "We will attack the camp at 0200 hours. Commandant Ziba will order his guards to stand down. They will be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protocols. They will not be harmed. But if any prisoners are injured during this operation, if any prisoners are evacuated, if any guards resist, then I will personally ensure that Commandant Ziba and every guard in that camp faces war crimes charges." Schiller nodded slowly. "I will convey your terms. You have until midnight to respond. After midnight, we attack regardless." The German officer saluted, a crisp military gesture that seemed oddly anachronistic in the rubble of Bad Orb, and departed under white flag. Vetelee watched him go. 12 hours. Either Ziba would accept surrender or Task Force Vesely would have to take the camp by force, in the dark, against defenders who might use prisoners as human shields. The mathematics were getting worse by the hour. Part 3, The Gates Private First Class. James Thornton didn't know rescue was 12 hours away. He knew only that he was dying slowly in Stalag 9B, and that dying slowly was significantly worse than he'd imagined when he'd enlisted in 1943. Thornton was 21 years old. He weighed 98 pounds. In December 1944, when the Germans captured him during the Ardennes offensive, he'd weighed 165 pounds. The arithmetic of starvation was precise and unforgiving. 67 pounds lost in 4 months, approximately 1/2 pound per day. If the trend continued, he had approximately 6 weeks before physiological systems would begin cascading failure. But Thornton didn't think in terms of cascading physiological failure. He thought in terms of hunger, constant, grinding, all-consuming hunger that had become the background reality of existence. The daily ration at Stalag 9B in April 1945 consisted of 1 thin slice of bread, often moldy, a watery soup containing potato peelings and occasional fragments of turnip. Sometimes a small piece of ersatz sausage made from materials Thornton preferred not to consider. Total caloric value, approximately 300 calories. A human body at rest requires roughly 1,500 calories daily to maintain basic functions. A body fighting disease, exposed to cold, performing forced labor requires significantly more. The mathematics created a deficit that the body paid by consuming itself. First fat reserves, then muscle tissue, eventually vital organs. Thornton lay on a wooden bunk in Barracks 7, which housed 86 men in a space designed for 40. The barracks smelled of unwashed bodies, dysentery, and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that Thornton had learned was the smell of men dying slowly. 3 prisoners had died in Barracks 7 in the past week. The bodies had been removed with efficient German punctuality each morning. New prisoners arrived to fill the empty bunks. The population remained constant even as the individuals changed. "You hear the guns?" asked Private Eddie Martinez from the bunk below. Martinez had been captured with Thornton during the same German attack in December. They'd survived 4 months together, which created a bond stronger than friendship, the shared recognition of fellow survivors. "Yeah," Thornton replied. "Been going on all day, closer than yesterday." "Think it's Americans?" "Who else would be advancing? Germans don't advance anymore. They retreat." Martinez was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a carefully controlled hope. "Think they're coming here?" Thornton didn't answer immediately. Hope was dangerous in Stalag 9B. Hope required energy that starving bodies couldn't afford to waste. Hope created expectations that, when disappointed, could break a man more effectively than any German guard. But the guns were getting closer. That was undeniable. "Maybe," Thornton finally said. "Maybe they're coming." Outside, somewhere in the camp, a whistle blew. Evening roll call. The daily ritual of organized humiliation, where 6,000 prisoners stood in neat rows while German guards counted them with methodical precision. The count never matched on the first attempt. Men collapsed during roll call. Men died during roll call. The guards would recount, adjust for casualties, and eventually dismiss everyone to another night of slow starvation. Thornton climbed down from his bunk, movements careful and deliberate. Fast movements required energy he didn't have. His body had become a resource management problem. Carefully allocate available calories to essential functions, eliminate all unnecessary expenditure. The roll call area was a muddy field surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers at each corner, manned by Wehrmacht soldiers with machine guns. More barbed wire beyond the towers, 3 rows deep, creating a fence that nobody could possibly cross. Beyond the wire, freedom. Theoretical freedom, the kind that existed on maps, but not in reality. 6,000 men formed ragged lines. Thornton took his place in the 5th row of his section. The man beside him was British, captured at Dunkirk in 1940. 5 years of German captivity had reduced him to a skeleton held together by will and spite. "Hear the artillery?" the British soldier asked. "American," Thornton replied. "How close?" "Close." The British soldier nodded. Around them, conversations rippled through the formation. Everyone had heard the guns. Everyone was calculating distances. speculating about American advance rates, wondering if rescue was hours away or days away, or a cruel illusion created by desperate men inventing hope from random noise. The German guards appeared, among them Commandant Ziba, a Wehrmacht captain who'd commanded Stalag 9B since January. Ziba was 53 years old, a career soldier who'd served on the Eastern Front before being assigned to POW camp duty after losing 3 fingers to Russian frostbite. He walked the rows of prisoners with the expression of a man inspecting inventory he knew was defective, but lacked authority to discard. Ziba stopped in front of Thornton's section. His eyes swept across the prisoners, hundreds of gaunt faces, thousands of eyes that watched with the flat wariness of abused dogs. "You hear the guns," Ziba said in English. His voice carried across the formation, amplified by the unnatural silence of 6,000 men holding their breath. "You think Americans are coming? Perhaps they are. War has many surprises." He paused. The pause extended. Thornton felt his heart accelerating, burning precious calories on anxiety. "Tomorrow morning," Ziba continued, "this camp will be evacuated. You will march west, 20 kilometers. There you will be transferred to other facilities. Bring what you can carry. We depart at dawn." The formation erupted in noise, shouts, protests, curses in 6 different languages. The guards raised their weapons. Ziba raised his hand for silence. "This is not negotiable," Ziba said. "It is ordered by Wehrmacht command. We evacuate at dawn. That is all." He turned and walked away. Behind him, 6,000 prisoners stood in shocked silence, processing the implications of his announcement. 20 kilometers, 12 miles. For healthy men, a 3-hour walk. For starving men in advanced stages of malnutrition, a death sentence. Half would collapse before reaching the destination. The Germans would shoot those who couldn't continue. The mathematics were simple and brutal. "They're going to kill us," Martinez whispered. "March us until we drop, then shoot us." Thornton didn't reply. Martinez was probably right. The Germans were losing the war. The Americans were advancing. The logical move for a retreating German army was to eliminate problems, and 6,000 Allied prisoners represented a significant problem. "Unless the Americans get here first," Thornton finally said. "How close do you think they are?" Thornton listened. In the distance, the artillery had stopped. The silence felt ominous. Were the Americans digging in for the night, preparing for a dawn assault, already retreating? "I don't know," Thornton admitted, "but we'll find out by morning." That night, sleep came in fragments. Men whispered in the darkness, sharing rumors, speculating about rescue, preparing for the march. Some prayed, some simply lay silent, conserving energy for whatever tomorrow brought. Thornton closed his eyes and tried to sleep. His body ached with the particular pain of advanced starvation, a deep, gnawing sensation that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with tissues consuming themselves. He thought about home, about his mother's kitchen, about meals he'd eaten 2 years ago that seemed impossibly distant now. He thought about the mathematical probability of surviving a 12-mile death march. The numbers were not encouraging. At 0200 hours on April 2, 1945, 3 M4 Sherman tanks began climbing the hill toward Stalag 9B. Lieutenant Michael Brennan commanded the lead tank. He'd received his orders at midnight, approach the camp, assess German defensive positions, be prepared to breach the main gate by force if necessary. The orders didn't explicitly say, "Rescue 6,000 starving prisoners," but the subtext was clear. Brennan's tank lurched over rough ground, the engine grinding in low gear. Behind him, 2 more Shermans followed. Infantry squads flanked the tanks, moving through darkness with weapons ready. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the pre-dawn blackness, sat the camp. "Visual on guard tower," Brennan's driver called out. 11 o'clock, 300 yards. Brennan peered through his periscope. The tower was a dark silhouette against a slightly less dark sky. No searchlights, no visible guards. Either the Germans had abandoned their posts or they were waiting in ambush. "Hold position," Brennan ordered. Infantry forward. The infantrymen advanced in a skirmish line, weapons raised. Brennan watched through his periscope, finger resting on the intercom button, ready to call fire support if German machine guns opened up. Nothing. The infantryman reached the tower, paused, then one soldier climbed the ladder. A moment later, his voice crackled over the radio. "Tower's empty? Gate is 50 yards ahead." Empty. The Germans had withdrawn, which meant either they'd surrendered or this was the most obvious trap in military history. All units advanced to the gate, Brennan ordered. The 3 Shermans rolled forward. The main gate of Stalag 9B emerged from darkness, a double barrier of barbed wire and timber, reinforced with steel posts, topped with additional wire. Behind the gate, Brennan could see barracks, guard buildings, and thousands of shapes that might be sleeping prisoners, or might be corpses, or might be hallucinations produced by exhaustion and adrenaline. "Commandant Ziba," Brennan shouted through the tank's external speaker. "This is the United States Army. Open the gate or we will breach it by force." Silence. Wind moved through the barbed wire, producing a faint metallic song. Otherwise, nothing. "Sir, I'm not seeing any guards," the driver said. "Place looks abandoned." It did look abandoned, which was impossible. 6,000 prisoners didn't abandon themselves. The Germans wouldn't simply leave the camp unguarded. "Ram the gate," Brennan ordered. "Slow speed. Watch for anti-tank mines." The Sherman's engine roared. The tank lurched forward. 30 tons of American steel struck the gate at 5 miles per hour, and the gate exploded inward, timber splintering, barbed wire screaming as it tore loose from posts, the entire structure collapsing in a thunder of destruction that woke every prisoner in Stalag 9B. The Sherman rolled through the breach and into the camp compound. Brennan opened his hatch and stood, exposing himself to potential sniper fire, because sometimes command required visible presence. "This is the United States Army," he shouted. "We're here to liberate this camp. All German guards surrender immediately." From the nearest barracks, a door opened. A figure stumbled out, skeletal, dressed in ragged uniform, moving with the uncertain gait of a man who'd forgotten how to believe in good fortune. More doors opened. More figures emerged, dozens, hundreds, thousands of prisoners flooding into the compound, surrounding the tanks, reaching out to touch American steel with hands that shook from malnutrition and disbelief. "Jesus Christ," Brennan's driver whispered. "Look at them." Brennan looked. He'd been briefed about the camp's condition. He'd read the Red Cross reports. He'd thought he understood what critical status meant. He hadn't understood anything. The prisoners were living skeletons. Their uniforms hung on frames that had lost half their body mass. Their faces had the sunken, hollow appearance of skulls wrapped in parchment. Their eyes held an expression Brennan had never seen before, a mixture of hope, terror, and the particular desperation of men who'd spent months dying slowly. "Sir," the radio crackled, "Commandant Ziba is requesting to formally surrender the camp. He's approaching your position with white flag." "Accepted," Brennan said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking. "Take him prisoner." Around the Sherman, prisoners were crying. Some were laughing. Some had collapsed to their knees, too weak to stand. One prisoner, American judging by his uniform remnants, was touching the tank's hull with both hands, as if confirming through tactile sensation that the rescue was real. Brennan climbed down from the tank. His boots hit German soil, and immediately he was surrounded by prisoners trying to shake his hand, pat his shoulder, simply touch another human being who represented freedom and survival, and the impossible notion that they might actually live through this war. "How many of you are there?" Brennan asked the nearest prisoner, an American sergeant whose name tag was too faded to read. 6,000, maybe more. We stopped counting the dead accurately in February. 6,000. The number he'd been told. The number that had seemed abstract until this moment, standing in a muddy compound surrounded by thousands of human beings who'd been systematically starved for months. "Can you walk?" Brennan asked. The sergeant laughed, a sound without humor. Some of us. Maybe half. The rest, he gestured toward the barracks. Too sick. Too weak. Dysentery. Typhus. Pneumonia. We've got a hospital barracks, but no medicine. Just men dying slower than the others. Brennan keyed his radio. Colonel Vetelee, this is Brennan. Camp is secure. German guards surrendered. But, sir, he paused, searching for words to convey what he was seeing. We're going to need medical support. Massive medical support. These men are in critical condition. Vetelee's voice crackled back. Understood. Medical units are standing by. Hold position. We're bringing up supply trucks now. Supply trucks. Food. Medicine. Water. All the resources the American military could provide, rendered suddenly precious by their absence in this camp. Around Brennan, the liberation continued in waves of stunned realization. Prisoners emerged from barracks in groups, supporting those too weak to walk alone. British soldiers, French soldiers, Soviet soldiers, and everywhere Americans, men who'd been captured in the Ardennes, men who'd survived 4 months of systematic deprivation, men who'd calculated their remaining lifespan in days and suddenly discovered they might actually have years. Private First Class James Thornton stumbled into the compound supported by Eddie Martinez. Both men moved with the careful deliberation of the severely malnourished. Thornton saw the Sherman tank and stopped, processing the impossible image before him. It's real, Martinez said. They actually came. Thornton nodded, unable to speak. His throat had closed with emotion, relief, joy, and something darker that he didn't have words for. Survivor's guilt, perhaps. The knowledge that he would live while others, the ones who died yesterday, last week, last month, would not. American soldiers, Martinez shouted, his voice cracking. We got American soldiers here. An infantry lieutenant approached them. You boys need medical attention? Everyone needs medical attention, Thornton managed. But start with Barracks 12. That's our hospital. Men dying there right now. The lieutenant keyed his radio, relaying the information. Within minutes, medics were moving through the camp with stretchers, morphine plasma, the full arsenal of 1945 military medicine applied to cases of extreme deprivation. Part 4. The Arithmetic of Survival. The evacuation of Stalag 9B took 10 days. That fact alone told the story of the camp's condition more eloquently than any report. 6,000 prisoners should have been transportable in 48 hours, load them on trucks, drive to Allied lines, process them through evacuation hospitals. Simple logistics. But these weren't 6,000 healthy soldiers. These were 6,000 men in various stages of medical crisis. Half couldn't walk without assistance. A quarter couldn't walk at all. Disease was so endemic that the entire camp functioned as an epidemiological nightmare. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, hemorrhagic fever, conditions the medics had seen only in Pacific Theater reports about Japanese prison camps. Colonel Vetelee established his command post in what had been Commandant Ziba's office. The German officer's desk still contained paperwork, neat columns documenting ration distributions, prisoner counts, death certificates. Vetelee read through the documents with growing anger. The paperwork was immaculate. Every death recorded, every calorie accounted for. The Germans had maintained perfect bureaucratic records while systematically starving 6,000 men. Colonel, medical situation report, Captain Morrison entered, carrying a clipboard thick with papers. We've evacuated 1,200 prisoners so far. Another 400 are staged for transport tomorrow. But, sir, the medical officer says we can't move the remaining prisoners without risk of mass casualties. Explain. They're too weak. Loading them on trucks, driving them over rough roads, it could kill them. The medical officer recommends establishing a field hospital here, stabilizing the critical cases before attempting evacuation. Vetelee considered. Establishing a field hospital meant remaining at Bad Orb longer. Longer meant greater risk that the Germans would organize a counterattack. Task Force Vesely had punched deep behind enemy lines. The longer they stayed, the more vulnerable they became. But the alternative was loading dying men onto trucks and hoping they survived the journey. How long does the medical officer need? Vetelee asked. Minimum 10 days. Possibly 2 weeks. We don't have 2 weeks. Division is planning to advance in 72 hours. We need to be ready to link up. Morrison nodded. Sir, what do we do with the prisoners who are too sick to move even after treatment? It was the question Vetelee had been avoiding. Some prisoners were too far gone. Months of starvation had inflicted damage that 1945 medicine couldn't repair. They would die whether moved or not. We save everyone we can save, Vetelee said. The ones who can't be saved, we make them comfortable. But nobody gets left behind. Nobody. Over the next 10 days, Stalag 9B transformed from German prison camp to American field hospital. Medical personnel arrived with supplies, plasma, morphine, sulfa drugs, bandages, antibiotics, food. Real food, not the watery soup and moldy bread the Germans had provided. The food presented its own medical challenge. Men who'd been starving for months couldn't immediately digest normal rations. Their digestive systems had atrophied. Feed them too much too quickly, and they'd die from refeeding syndrome, a metabolic cascade where the body, suddenly receiving nutrients, demanded more than the heart and other organs could provide. So the meals started small, broth, crackers, gradually increasing portions as bodies relearned how to process nourishment. Some prisoners gained 5 pounds in the first week. Others continued losing weight, their bodies too damaged to recover. Private First Class James Thornton sat in the medical tent eating a bowl of chicken broth with the reverence of a religious ritual. The broth contained actual chicken. He could see pieces of meat floating in the liquid. After 4 months of turnip soup, real chicken tasted like a hallucination. Slow down, a medic cautioned. I know you're hungry, but your stomach can't handle it if you eat too fast. Thornton forced himself to take smaller sips. The medic was right. His stomach already felt uncomfortably full after only half the bowl. 4 months ago, he could have eaten 3 bowls without thinking. Now, 8 ounces of broth was a feast. What happens next? Thornton asked. You'll be evacuated to a rear area hospital. They'll monitor your recovery, treat any lingering infections, get you healthy, then probably stateside for additional treatment and rehabilitation. Stateside, home. The word felt abstract, like a concept that existed only in theory. Thornton had spent so long in Stalag 9B that normal life, American life, free life, had become difficult to imagine. How long until I can go home? The medic shrugged. Depends on your recovery. Some guys will be ready in a month, others might take 6 months. You're lucky, you're ambulatory, your organs are functioning. I've seen worse cases today. Lucky. Thornton turned the word over in his mind. He'd lost 67 pounds. He'd watched friends die from diseases that shouldn't kill young men. He'd spent 4 months wondering if each day would be his last. But he was alive. That made him lucky. By April 12, 1945, all 6,000 prisoners had been evacuated from Stalag 9B. 53 died during the evacuation, mostly from complications of advanced starvation, hearts that couldn't handle the stress of transport, infections that had progressed too far, organs that had been damaged beyond recovery. The medics tried everything. Sometimes everything wasn't enough. Lieutenant Colonel Vetelee stood in the empty camp on April 13th, watching engineers prepare to demolish the barracks. The structures would be burned, the ashes buried, the earth reclaimed. In 6 months, nothing would remain to indicate that 6,000 men had suffered here. Captain Morrison approached. All units ready to withdraw, sir. Division has secured the corridor. We can return to friendly lines. Vetelee nodded. Task Force Vesely had completed its mission. They'd penetrated 37 miles behind enemy lines, fought through German defenses, liberated a POW camp, evacuated 6,000 prisoners, and suffered remarkably light casualties. 14 killed, 38 wounded. The mathematics suggested success. But Vetelee kept thinking about the paperwork in Commandant Ziba's desk, the neat columns, the careful accounting, the 300 calories per day that had killed 12 men daily through systematic bureaucratic starvation. Sir? Morrison prompted. I'm coming. Vetelee took one last look at the camp. barracks that had held too many men, guard towers that had imprisoned the innocent, barbed wire that had defined the boundary between captivity and freedom. They'd saved 6,000 men. That was worth remembering. They'd arrived just in time to prevent a death march that would have killed 1,800. That was worth remembering, too. But somewhere in his mind, Vetelee couldn't stop calculating the other numbers, the prisoners who'd been removed before Task Force Vesely arrived, the Jewish POWs and troublemakers who'd been sent to Berga concentration camp in February, 350 men who disappeared into the Nazi system before rescue could reach them. He'd read the intelligence reports. 70 of those 350 had already died at Berga. The remainder were still there, still suffering conditions that made Stalag 9B look merciful by comparison. Save everyone. That had been his promise. But some men couldn't be saved because they'd been taken beyond reach before rescue arrived. The mathematics of war were unforgiving. You calculated success by counting the living. But the dead, the ones you couldn't save, those numbers stayed with you long after the victory reports were filed. "Let's go home," Vetelee said. Task Force Vesely withdrew from Bad Orb on April 13th. Behind them, Stalag 9B burned. Epilogue: The Weight of Numbers. James Thornton returned to the United States in July 1945 aboard a hospital ship. He weighed 137 pounds, 41 pounds more than his weight at liberation, 28 pounds less than his pre-capture weight. The doctor said he'd probably regain the remaining weight over the next year. Probably. Bodies remembered starvation. The scars were internal and permanent. He spent 3 months at a military hospital in Virginia, eating carefully calibrated meals and attending therapy sessions where doctors asked questions about his experience. Thornton answered some questions. Others, he deflected. Some experiences didn't translate into words. In October 1945, he received his discharge papers and a train ticket to Iowa. His mother met him at the station. She'd aged 10 years in the 18 months since he'd left. She cried when she saw him, then tried to hide the crying, then gave up and simply held him while they both stood on the platform amid returning soldiers and reuniting families. "I made your favorite," she said. "Pot roast, with potatoes and carrots, and apple pie for dessert." Thornton felt his throat close. "Mom, I can't eat that much. Not yet. My stomach." "Then you'll eat what you can," she interrupted. "And tomorrow you'll eat a little more, and the day after a little more. We'll get you healthy again." It took 2 years. 2 years of carefully increasing portions, of rebuilding muscle mass, of learning to sleep without nightmares about barbed wire and guard towers. Some nights he'd wake up calculating calories, counting rations, doing the mathematics of survival before he remembered he didn't need to anymore. He married in 1948, had children in 1950 and 1952, built a life that was determinedly aggressively normal. He worked in a hardware store, coached Little League, attended church on Sundays. He almost never talked about Stalag 9B, but once a year on April 2nd he would drive alone to a hilltop outside town and sit watching the sunrise, remembering the morning 3 Sherman tanks crashed through a barbed wire gate and transformed mathematics into miracle. Walter Vetelee retired from the Army in 1962 as a full colonel. He'd served in Korea and spent a decade training infantry units. He was good at his job, methodical, thorough, able to calculate the odds and make decisions under pressure. But he never forgot Stalag 9B, never forgot the neat columns in Commandant Ziba's paperwork, never forgot the 53 prisoners who died during evacuation despite everything the medics tried, never forgot the 350 men who'd been taken to Berga before Task Force Vesely arrived. In 1971, he testified before a congressional committee investigating American POWs in German camps. The congressman asked about liberation operations, about military planning, about logistics and casualties. Vetelee answered their questions. Then, at the end of his testimony, he added something that wasn't in his prepared remarks. "You asked me if the mission was successful," he said. "We saved 6,000 men. By any metric, that's success. But I want you to understand something about war. Success isn't measured only by what you save, it's measured also by what you lose. We arrived at Stalag 9B on April 2nd. The Germans planned to evacuate on April 3rd. One day. If we'd been delayed one day, 1,800 men would have died on a death march. One day's difference between rescue and catastrophe. That's how war works. That's how close we came to failing. So, yes, we succeeded. But success was never guaranteed. It was purchased with speed, violence, and luck. Take away any of those elements, and we would have arrived too late. He paused, looking at the congressman. The lesson isn't that we succeeded. The lesson is that we almost didn't. Remember that when you send men to war. Remember that success is always provisional, always dependent on timing and chance, and 1,000 variables you can't control. We saved 6,000 men. We lost 350 who were taken before we arrived. Those numbers matter, both of them. The committee thanked him for his testimony. The transcript was filed. Nobody particularly remembered his final statement. But Vetelee remembered. He remembered until he died in 1989 at age 76, with photographs of his grandchildren on the wall and memories of German prison camps in his mind. Coda. What the numbers mean. In the final accounting, Task Force Vesely's dash to Stalag 9B saved 5,147 Allied prisoners, 6,000 liberated minus 53 who died during evacuation. Those 5,147 men returned to their countries, their families, their lives. They married, had children, built careers, lived decades that German starvation would have stolen. Calculate the impact across generations. 5,147 men produced approximately 18,000 children. Those children produced approximately 45,000 grandchildren. Those grandchildren are producing great-grandchildren now in numbers that strain calculation. One military operation, 37 miles, 10 days. The decision to launch a tactically questionable deep penetration mission created a genealogical cascade that touches hundreds of thousands of lives. But the mathematics have shadows. 350 Jewish American POWs and troublemakers were removed from Stalag 9B in February 1945 and sent to Berga concentration camp. They were worked as slave labor in underground tunnels. They were starved. They were beaten. 73 died before American forces liberated Berga on April 23rd. Those 73 men don't get to produce children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Their branch of the genealogical tree was cut off. The families that would have descended from them exist only as ghosts, mathematical possibilities that never became reality. War produces numbers, casualty figures, liberation statistics, survival rates. But numbers are abstractions. Behind every digit is a human being who lived, suffered, hoped, and either survived or didn't. James Thornton survived. He lost 67 pounds and gained a lifetime of nightmares, but he survived. He watched his children graduate college. He held his grandchildren. He lived to see the Berlin Wall fall and the Cold War end. He died in 2003 at age 79, surrounded by family, in a hospital bed that was nothing like a wooden bunk in Stalag 9B. His survival was not guaranteed. It was contingent on a military commander deciding to launch a desperate rescue mission, on tank crews successfully breaching German lines, on medics arriving with plasma and antibiotics, on 10,000 variables aligning correctly. Change any one variable, delay the mission by 24 hours, lose an additional Sherman to German fire, run out of medical supplies, and Thornton dies, along with hundreds or thousands of others whose survival depended on timing, luck, and decisions made by people who never knew their names. That's the mathematics of war. That's the weight of numbers. Every survival is a miracle of aligned probabilities. Every death is a collapse of possibilities. Task Force Vesely's dash to Stalag 9B was successful by any objective measure. They saved nearly 6,000 men from certain death. That success deserves commemoration. But success is always incomplete, always shadowed by what couldn't be saved, always haunted by the question, What if we'd arrived one day earlier, 1 week earlier? What if we'd known about Berga in time? The answer is unknowable. The questions remain. And somewhere in Iowa, a grandson of James Thornton sits at a computer researching his grandfather's war experience, reading about Stalag 9B and Task Force Vesely, trying to understand how close he came to never existing. He's calculating probabilities, measuring the distance between survival and extinction, discovering that his entire life, his parents' lives, his own existence, depended on 3 Sherman tanks crashing through a barbed wire gate at 2 o'clock in the morning on April 2nd, 1945. Some numbers you can calculate precisely. Other numbers, the value of a life, the weight of a rescue, the cost of arriving almost too late, those numbers exceed mathematics. They require something else, memory perhaps, gratitude, or simply the recognition that behind every historical statistic, behind every casualty figure and liberation count, are human beings whose existence mattered then and matters now and will matter for generations we'll never meet. 6,000 men walked out of Stalag 9B in April 1945. They were hungry, they were sick, they were broken in body and sometimes spirit, but they walked out. They went home. They lived. That's not just history. That's not just numbers. That's everything.